Welcome to this RSK Biosensors First Thursday Club webinar. I'm Des Delahaye, I'm a director here at RSK Biosensors, and it's my pleasure to host today's presentation, which is on the subject of the management of invasive non-native species. But before I introduce our speakers for the day, there's a few housekeeping items I need to quickly go through with you. So the first thing is that all of the mics will be turned off during the presentation to prevent any heckling. But that's not because we don't want to hear from you. If you've got anything to say, then please pop your questions in the chat. We'll have a Q&A session at the end, and we'll rattle through as many of those as possible. Any questions that we don't manage to answer, we'll see if our speakers can answer them by email later. You'll be sent a link after the end of the event to get some feedback. Please do spend a couple of minutes filling it out, please. It helps us to make sure that the content of these webinars stays relevant and engaging for you. So on to the main event. We have two speakers today, both from our colleague RSK company SES. So I'm happy to welcome Rob Harrison-Lacey. Rob is a director of ecology at SES. He has 16 years of experience as an ecological consultant under his belt, and he's worked for a whole wide variety of public and private sector clients and has held a variety of different Natural England class and European protected species licenses. And he's joined by Thomas Edwards, who is invasive weeds manager at SES. He has a background in horticulture and 15 years experience in managing green spaces, and more recently is obsessed with the control of invasive weeds on sites. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Rob.
Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. It's amazing to see so many people join us. As we've mentioned, the talk today is going to be on the management of invasive species. And what we're going to do, just as a little agenda, we're going to run through a bit of identification and how we do risk assessments on these invasives. I won't go through lots of them, I'll just stick to about 4, and then give you some resources as well that you can go away and have a look at if you want a bit more information. We're also going to touch on some legal compliance and what the legislation says. And then we're going to go on to how we develop our management plans and look at some of the different treatment methods for the invasive species. And within that, we're going to touch on the importance of having insurance-backed guarantees for developers when they're looking at those different management plans and treatment methods. And then finally, we're going to end on some post-treatment enhancement strategies and ongoing monitoring and biosecurity that you need to consider. So we've had a little introduction so far, but I just thought I'd quickly give you a bit more of a background of why I've got an interest for invasive species, and also I'll hand over to Thomas in a second as well, so he can do the same. But I've, as mentioned, I've been working, I think, for over 16 years now in ecology. And right from the very start of my career, I was involved with invasive species, particularly doing lots of work with a plant called Crassula helmsii, which I'll talk about shortly. And doing control methods from that. I've also done quite a lot of public speaking with invasive species in mind and biosecurity as well. So I used to speak at the Robson meeting, and I've done the FINS conference and a few SIEM things as well. So in terms of kind of going into the research part of invasive species, I've done quite a lot of work with that. And that then relays back into how we do all of the practical management and actually solve some of these problems that we get with invasives. Thomas, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Absolutely. Thanks, Rob. And yes, just to say the same thing. Thank you for everyone for joining us today. So my name is Thomas Edwards. I have been with SES for a couple of years now. I basically started my career as a gardener. Growing food was kind of the thing that got me into horticulture, and then from kind of gardening, we went into managing people, managing sites, managing contracts, managing departments, and that's kind of led me to where I am today. for SES. So I run the invasive weed department, and we cover everything here from site surveying to management plans, reporting, all the kind of herbicide excavation works, cloacal works. So yes, it's really fun department to be in. I have a lot of passion for plants, so I hope that comes across today. Back over to you, Rob.
Excellent. So the first slides we've got, we're going to just jump into some identification of these invasive non-native species. And the first one that I'm going to show you guys, I hope you all know this as well already, or most of you should know about this one, is Japanese knotweed. And if you look at the top of the slide where I put the Latin name as well, this used to be called Fallopian japonica, and it's had its name changed fairly recently. So just keep an eye out for that. If you're the people that do reporting, make sure you use the correct Latin name now that it's changed as well. But to identify it, it's quite an easy species to ID really, because it grows to about 6 feet tall, and so it's quite a tall, robust plant. It does die back though over winter, and the canes that it produces, which sort of look a bit like a bamboo cane almost once the leaves have dropped off, they can crumble, and they're quite fragile, and they'll disappear over the winter period. So you kind of end up with these little mounds of rhizome crown at the base of the plant that's the only visible thing in winter. But when it is in full growth, as I mentioned, it grows to about 6 feet tall, and it has these leaves that come off the main stem. And if you look at the part of the slide, the photo on the left, you'll see that it's got this really distinctive zigzag pattern between each leaf, so it kind of bounces off onto a new leaf each time in a different direction. They have a really lush green colour. And then when you look at the stems, they have this quite nice looking, actually, purple speckled colour to them, and regular nodes all the way up and down the stem. The leaves are a shield shape and have this quite distinctive flat base to them. And then the rhizome, which is the bit that you don't actually really see because obviously it's underground, is this very muddy brown colour. They're usually around the same thickness as your thumb, maybe a bit bigger sometimes, but they always have these little tiny white roots that come off them, which you can see on the right hand side of the photo there. And if you cut it in half, which please don't do, because obviously you'd be digging it up and possibly causing spread if you did that. But if you were to cut it in half, you would see that the inside of the rhizome is this really bright orange colour. And the reason why Japanese knotweed is so nasty as one of the invasives is because of this rhizome structure that it has. It spreads purely from root fragments and rhizome being spread and travelled around the country, and that happens through either horticultural reasons, or it might spread through soil movements within the construction industry and that type of thing. So it spreads very prevalently from very small fragments of rhizome, but these rhizomes form extremely dense and far-reaching networks, and they're very powerful as well, so they can break through concrete, and obviously within our modern world with housing and road networks and infrastructure, we don't want our concrete to be broken up by these nasty invasive species. So that's why it causes such an issue and needs to be controlled. The next species I'm going to just do a bit of ID on, which is nice for everyone to be aware of, is giant hogweed. And with this one, again, it dies back fully in winter. And you can see the picture there with the man stood next to a flowering stem. So it has all of that growth in one season, which is, I think, really phenomenal. It's a really impressive plant. The leaves grow up to about 3 meters in diameter, and they have this really sharply divided serrated leaf structure to them. And they're quite bristly on the undersides as well. There's lots of hairs going on this plant. It's quite bristly, kind of spiky little thing. If you look at the stems, they have this small purple blotch that grows on it. So that's another nice key ID feature to look out for. And then the flowers, when it's in flowering mode, you get usually a white flower to them, sometimes with a little touch of pink maybe, but they form these really big umbrella shaped flower heads, and the kind of the number of seeds that they can produce is absolutely phenomenal. So as I've mentioned, this grows afresh every year from a seed. So one of these seed flower heads can produce absolutely thousands of seeds, and they can be spread around. Quite often you get this in damp areas or on riverbanks, so it'll easily float downstream and recolonize and encroach into new areas through that mechanism. One of the reasons why this is so bad as an invasive species is it's actually injurious to us. So the sap, if it gets on your skin, causes a phyto response, and will cause your skin to blister in the sunlight. I've not put any pictures up of that today because some of them are quite gruesome and gory, but if you're interested, do just Google it and you'll see how horrific some of these burns can be from this plant. So in that respect, it's one that we definitely need to control and not have on our sites. The next one that I've got to show you guys is Himalayan balsam. And this one, again, grows afresh every single year from its seed. So all of the growth that you get is from 1 year's growth, and it grows to about 3 or 4 feet tall. Sometimes you get it a little bit taller than that as well if it's in a shaded situation, so it'll be reaching a bit higher towards the sun. And it has this very distinctive trumpet-shaped flower that's this kind of very nice pink colour, really. It has a very sweet scent as well, so like a very overly sugared honeysuckle is the scent that it has. And the leaves have this very kind of pointed tip to them, a very finely serrated edge, and they have a midrib that's quite a very strong midrib to them as well. They are very shallow rooted plants, so that's something that I'll talk about in a second, why they're so bad. But their mechanism of spread, as I mentioned, is by a seed, and their seed pods, when they ripen, they actually have a catapult mechanism in them that causes the seed pod to explode and project the seeds far into the distance, so it can go several meters away from the parent plant and spread that way. And then, because they typically like to grow in slightly damp areas, they're very prevalent on riverbanks, and obviously those seeds can wash downstream as well. So it has a very good mechanism of spread. And these seeds as well, we'll come on to biosecurity a bit later, they really easily get stuck in the treads of your boots. So if you're not checking the treads of your boots after you've been on a site that's got Himalayan balsam, you'll very easily spread a seed to another site that you visit afterwards, and it has a good mechanism of spread that way as well. The reason why this species is so bad for the environment relates back to that shallow rooting that I mentioned. So it will grow on a riverbank. It grows to, as I mentioned, 3 or 4 feet tall, and it has these dense foliage. So it'll shade out all of our native species underneath it. And then it dies back over winter. And because it dies back and has the shallow rooting system, that then causes a lot of soil erosion over the winter flood periods, and you'll get a lot more siltation going into rivers, which causes issues with flooding downstream as well. And it just generally is bad ecologically because you don't want to have an overload of silt going into your river. And by having bare riverbanks over the winter period, because this has shaded everything out and then died back itself, that's what's going to be happening. And then the last species I'm going to show you guys today, just for a bit of ID, so you can be aware of it when you're out and about, is New Zealand pygmy or Crassula helmsii. And I've actually done quite a lot of work on this one with control programs. So I'll talk about that shortly for you. But to identify it, it's a really small, cushiony forming plant. It grows in aquatic situations, so it'll grow fully submerged within still water, so lakes and ponds. However, it's very, very happy with a fluctuating water table. So if you've got a damp area, it'll quite happily live there as well and form these cushions. The leaves are up to 2 centimeters long, and they're quite fleshy, and they grow in opposite pairs along the leaf stem. They always have a little pointed tip to them as well. But if you look on the right hand side of this picture that we've got here, you see the little black arrow that points to the leaf bases that join the stem. That bit there is called the node, and you literally just need one node to form an entire new clump of plants. And this plant will break up very easily if you step on it, and you can get one of those nodes stuck in your shoes. And as I mentioned earlier with Himalayan balsam seeds, that's how it can very easily spread around the country, just by our actions and us going between different places. So New Zealand pygmy weed also has a flower. However, it's not known to set seed in the UK. We think that they're all sterile flowers that are in the UK, but they have, if you've got them flowering, you can notice this as an ID feature. So we have 4 petals in this kind of star shape. And again, it's another really nicely scented plant. It smells really nice of honey. So it is quite pretty in that sense. And the reason why this one is so bad and we need to be aware of it and do control for it is that it will cause early succession of ponds. So if it gets into a pond, it'll outcompete all of the native species that are there, that are grown below it, and it will deoxygenate the water column, because it will start to fill up the pond, grow on the surface, out and across the pond, and you won't have any oxygenating plants underneath it, so it can start deoxygenating the pond and making it less valuable ecologically. And it also, because of the volume of biomass that it actually grows into, it will cause early succession of your pond as well. So you'll find that then starts to disappear. So a really important one to know about, and come up with control measures, and also stop its spread through biosecurity measures to other places. Obviously, those 4 species I've just shown you now, they're not exhausted. There's loads and loads of non-native species out there. And what I wanted to do is direct you guys to a really brilliant resource called the Non-Native Species Secretariat. There's a website for it there, but if you just type that into Google, you'll be able to find it. It'll come up as one of the first things that's in that search. And that website is an absolutely brilliant resource if you want to find out more. So you can look at the fact sheets of a whole load of different invasive species. There's even some training that you can do on there. There's a webinar training session, so you can click on that and it'll give you more details about invasive species. And it also has a whole section on biosecurity, and that's the bit that I urge everyone to take a look at to brush up on what you should be doing yourselves for biosecurity to prevent the spread of invasive species. So now we've gone over a few ID features, we're on to the next section of the talk, and we're kicking this off with a bit of legal compliance, and then we'll go into the management techniques and all the interesting stuff of how we deal with invasive species. So I'll try and keep the legal compliance bit really short, because I realise it is probably the most boring bit of it, and as you can tell, I've not got any pictures on this slide because I couldn't think of an interesting picture to put up for legal compliance. But the primary legislation that we have for invasive species, and the reason why we legally have to do things on our sites with them, is the Wildlife and Countryside Act. That's the main one, and that one lists all of the Schedule 9 species, which are the invasives. That's updated fairly often as well, so as we get new ones that come into the country or new ones are considered a threat, we have that added on to Schedule 9. So it's well worth keeping it up to date with any changes that are made to that schedule, so you're aware of which ones are considered invasive. We also have the Invasive Alien Species Enforcement and Permitting Order, and that one is more concerned with the sale of plants. So you remember I've just shown you Crassula helmsii, the New Zealand pygmy weed. Only quite recently, not too long ago, that was made illegal for sale, and previously it was sold at garden centres and in the aquaculture trade as an oxygenating plant within aquariums, and obviously if you're selling it to the public, you lose control of where it's going to be placed, and that's how that has spread around the country as well. So that's a really nice important piece of legislation. And then we also have the Environmental Protection Act 1990, and this gives us the duty of care for waste. So some of these invasive species are actually considered controlled waste, and the soils that they grow in within a certain radius would be considered controlled waste as well, because you might have, for example, the rhizomes of Japanese knotweed within that soil, or you might have the seeds of giant hogweed within that soil as well. So that's one of the pieces of legislation that kind of puts a high cost on the control and what you do as your management plan if you're needing to move soils around your site. So with those pieces of legislation, it obviously comes with certain legal duties, and the main one really is that you shouldn't be purposefully or recklessly allowing the release of invasive species into the wild. And that's the real key take home for that as a legal duty. So you should be showing that you're doing everything within your power to not cause the spread of these invasive species any further. And if you're found in breach of any of that, it can result in fines. It can also result in remediation notices, which could be quite costly. And there's also been instances where companies have been given ASBOs, so antisocial behaviour orders, for allowing these invasive species to spread from their land onto a neighbour's property, because obviously that's causing an issue for someone else. They've been given an ASBO for that. And the main regulators for this are either Natural England or the Environment Agency. So when we are then considering our sites, and we know that we've got invasive species present and we want to do something about it, we have to do a bespoke management plan. And with that, we typically go out and we do a species survey, work out which invasives are present. Usually our clients flag this to us and say, oh, we think we've got Japanese knotweed on site. And then we'll turn up and we'll find probably 3 or 4 other invasive species as well that need to be considered. So we record which species are there, we do the extent, so map where the areas of it are, and we look at the level of infestation. So sometimes it might be an established infestation, sometimes it might be really early on, and obviously if you catch it early on, it's easier to deal with. We then look at all of the site-specific constraints and how the land's going to be used and how that might impact management plans. And with that all in mind, we then come up with an appropriate control and monitoring strategy, and we'll put that forward to the client and then take it forward. And I've got some management strategies and the techniques that we're going to talk about shortly. But before I do that, I'm going to pass over to Thomas, because he's just going to give us a bit of information about the insurance-backed guarantees that you should be seeing when you have a treatment plan in place on your site.
Great, thank you. Yes, so insurance-backed guarantees are basically when we've completed work on a site or a project, and we have completed a number of monitoring years, which depends on the species that we are trying to control or eradicate, then we will give a works guarantee. So say, for example, we've had 3 years after excavating Japanese knotweed, nothing's come back for 3 years. We will then give out a works guarantee for up to 10 years, or it will be to cover 10 years. An insurance-backed guarantee policy, basically an insurance policy that supports basically the company for if we go bust or stop providing the services, or the company goes under, then the insurance-backed guarantee kind of swoops in and still covers all of everything that we had in place. So it's real peace of mind, especially for our developer clients. They're kind of the main ones that look for it. It's pretty much a double guarantee for your clients.
That's great, and I think it's really important to know with that guarantee as well that that's kind of the industry best practice and the UK regulatory standard. So if you're getting a management plan in place and a control program for your invasives on site, definitely something that you should be looking out for, so that you know you're doing the best practice. So I'm going to go through very quickly some of the treatment methods that are options for dealing with invasive species. And the first one we're going to talk about is herbicide applications. And with this, there's a few different ways you can apply your herbicides. Obviously, in terms of environmental protection, chemicals in the environment are considered a bad thing. So you should only be using this if there's an absolute need for it. And also the technique that you're going to be using will dictate how effective your treatment plan is going to be, so you're using the chemicals wisely, and it'll also allow you to target only the host species, so you're not accidentally killing off another plant that's adjacent to it. So the ways that you can do this, you can use a knapsack sprayer. So the photo that we've got on this slide shows some knapsack spraying that's going on. And that's kind of really good for slightly broad applications, but you can also do spot treatments with it of like little areas. So when I mentioned earlier, I've done quite a lot of work with Crassula helmsii, that New Zealand pygmy weed, where we've done that, we were able to do spot treatments and prevent the population of that plant getting too big. So that's been a really useful technique that we've used there. Another technique you can use is stem injection, and obviously that's really direct and doesn't impact any of the surrounding vegetation because you're only getting the exact species that you're wanting, and that's very typically done with Japanese knotweed. It's one of the really good techniques that you can use for that. And then if you've got a broader area of area that you need to tackle, you can use ATV spraying, and that covers a much larger area. And I think, Thomas, you've got some examples of where you've used that before, haven't you?
Yes, so it definitely is the more efficient way of controlling kind of weeds over a larger rough kind of areas. Saves the legs and the back and the shoulders a lot. But one of the things that we come across a lot is people forget that it does need another part of being certified. So it's your PA2A. After your PA1 has been passed, you can then add this, and it's basically the use of boom sprayers, mounted or trailered, so it can be on an ATV, tractor, or like we just said, trailers. So one of the scary things with ATVs, which we've witnessed, is people kind of just think, hey, we can just put a dollop of product in a tank, a bit more for luck, and then we'll whiz around here because we've got this cool little ATV and get the job done and hope for the best, which is a real big no-no. It still needs that same kind of sensitive approach as you would with a backsack. So there's make sure we have the correct nozzles, the calibrations all set up and correct. We're measuring it correctly, and the recording's done. And obviously, any compliances with the environmental agency are being adhered to. So, yes, it's a great tool to use, but it's just needs a second thought before kind of going ahead with it. But also very good fun to drive.
Excellent. So the next method that you can use for control of invasive species, and this one is probably the most invasive and kind of applied method, is the mechanical control. And you can see the photo here, we've been doing some mechanical control and creating a bund to remove Japanese knotweed. So with this, it's very good at removing large volumes of soil that might have rhizome in it. And what you typically do with that is then hopefully have an area on site where you can create a bund and then bury the soils that have been contaminated with the invasive species. This then allows you to cap it with a geotextile and then put a topsoil, a clean topsoil over, and it can be then incorporated back into the landscaping scheme on the site. So if you've got the area and the space to do that, that's a really effective technique. However, if you've not got enough space on site, then unfortunately, if you were to go down this route, you'd then have to look at off-site disposal, and that comes with very high costs because there's transfer licenses when you take it to the registered landfills that can take this material that has invasive species on, and there's also the duty of care and waste regulations that need to be considered for it. So when you're getting those waste transfer notes, you need to make sure you've got really rigorous documentation maintained for audit purposes and legal assurances. So that's mechanical removal or burial on site. And then one of the other control options that I think is a really nice one, and actually is the direction that a lot of things are going in, is biological control options. And at the moment, there's a research company called CABI, C-A-B-I, and they do lots of work with looking at rusts, because rusts are usually host specific, and then can knock the plant back. And they've been doing some trials releasing that for Japanese knotweed, and I believe for Himalayan balsam as well. But I've got a nice picture up here of a little weevil, and it's on a plant called azolla, which is water fern. And this is one of the really good win stories for biological control. So this weevil is very specific to water fern. It's the only thing it eats, so we know that it's not going to transfer onto other things. It's also native within southern France and the Mediterranean area, so it's kind of not too far away from us. However, it's knocked back in hard frosts, so we know that with our winters in the UK that we get, if we release this, it's only going to last one season, so you would have to repopulate the weevil population. But it just basically munches its way through all of the water fern, and then controls it to allow suitable low levels where it's not going to be causing an issue for your water body. So that's a really nice example of a biological control, and there's lots of others being developed at the moment, which are good news stories to keep up to speed with. So we're on to the last slide now, and we're just going to talk a little bit about post-treatment revegetation and ecological enhancements, because I've touched there on the sort of the mechanisms that you control invasive species with herbicides and mechanical treatments, and obviously they're quite destructive methods. So we're not in the game of just blanket clearing a site. We want to make sure that if we're dealing with something that's an invasive species, we control it properly, we do it ethically and to the lowest impact possible, but then afterwards we reinstate and do as much as possible to put more back and be in line with biodiversity net gain principles. So we typically try to use native, locally sourced seed mixes and apply those to the sites after we've controlled an invasive species. But saying that, we also encourage natural regeneration. I actually had a client recently, not complain, but just very sternly question why their newly dug pond wasn't particularly greening up very much at the moment. And it's because we wanted to allow it to naturally regenerate rather than us introducing plants from horticultural suppliers, which could potentially introduce new invasive species or aquatic-borne pathogens. So that natural regeneration is actually really important to allow that to happen, and it's the safest bet if you don't risk introducing another nasty once you've already cleared it of an invasive species. We also try to do lots of enhancements as well, and within re-establishing habitats following the treatment of invasive species, we try to create lots of pollinator habitats and also increase connectivity within the wildlife corridors. And this is really vital when we're talking about biodiversity net gain. At the moment, biodiversity net gain is probably one of the biggest buzzwords around in ecology. And if you've got invasive species on your site, typically your habitat condition will be in a poor condition. By doing a control method and eradicating or controlling that invasive species, you can increase your condition of your habitat and therefore get more biodiversity net gain units for your site. So that's a really key reason quite often why we're doing these management plans and control methods for invasive species. And then lastly, it's really, really important to keep ongoing monitoring after you've done all this work. Quite frequently, without ongoing monitoring, invasive species can get back into the site because they obviously had a pathway in there in the first instance. So we need to look at what those pathways are, try and stop them, and then do ongoing monitoring to make sure that those invasives don't come back. And if they are recorded coming back through the monitoring, catching them at that really early stage makes the treatment going forward so much more easy and able to do it. So that's what we're doing in that sense. And our very last point, which I've touched on throughout this as well, is just about biosecurity. Obviously, when we're doing all of this work, it's really important to let all of the contractors know that invasive species are on site, and they have to do certain precautions like wheel washes and following things like the check, clean, dry approach, which I've got on this slide here on the right hand side. And this check, clean, dry approach is really vital for ensuring that invasive species aren't spread from the site that's got them to the new areas and different habitats. So there we go. We've kind of come to the end of our allotted time now as well. I can hand over for any questions.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thanks, Rob and Thomas. We've had a few questions drop into the chat box, so let's start off with a nice simple one for you guys. We've got a question here about what are the sort of typical characteristics that would allow you to distinguish giant hogweed from other hogweeds?
Okay, yeah, that's a really good point. So we do have a native hogweed in the UK as well, but it's obviously, with the name suggesting giant hogweed, it's much smaller than the invasive giant one. So when it's in its full growth stage, the size is kind of your really obvious first hint that that's going to be a different species. And then there's also subtle differences with the seeds. So if you've got mature plants, you can look at the seed heads, and also the serration of the leaves. So our native hogweed is much more or less serrated in its leaf structure, and the leaf is obviously smaller as well. If you go on the non-native species secretariat webpage, they have a fact sheet, in fact, about giant hogweed, and they put the similar species next to it, so you can see the differences there. It's difficult to verbally describe this, but you can then see a visual representation of that if you want to look at that resource.
Great, thanks. So we've had a couple of questions about the changing climate. How do you think that some plants that might already be here, for example, might take advantage of changing climate and become a bit of a problem for us? Do you think there are some suspects out there just waiting for that opportunity?
There are, definitely, yes, and that's something that legislators are looking at quite closely. So when we ban plants for sale, that's one of the areas that they're looking at. If our climate is going to be changing, potentially getting warmer with less frosty winters, certain species that we know are just across the water in France that are a problem there could become a problem over here as well. And there's a classic example of that that's on the lookout at the moment, one called water lettuce. It's knocked back by a hard frost, but if we don't receive those hard frosts, that's one that could kind of spread quite prevalently, and it's actually sold in garden centres because it's really pretty. So a lot of gardens buy it every year, put it in their ponds, dies off over winter because of the frosts. But if we're not getting that, that could then take off and then become a problem for our more naturalised water bodies as well.
Great, thank you. A legal sort of question here. What are the obligations on private landowners in relation to invasive non-native species? And the questioner gives an example of seeing an awful lot of Japanese knotweed and Himalayan balsam beside a river where the footpath could easily allow spread. What is the landowner obliged to do anything legally about that? So
there's no strict obligation to do something in advance of it becoming an issue and you being reported. So in that sense, you have to be reported as causing a nuisance and an issue for your neighbouring land. So in that case, that's what would trigger you wanting to do something about it. But the main point in the legislation is that you're not allowed to cause the spread of these invasive species that are on Schedule 9 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act into the wild. So if you were a landowner that has a site that borders onto a protected designated site, you'd want to be very careful that you're not under scrutiny from the owners of that designation and allowing your invasive that's on your land spread into theirs. So that's kind of the main point for the legislation, is don't allow it to spread into the wild.
Right. Here's an interesting problem, which you may have some answers to. The questioner says, I've seen Himalayan balsam in a solar farm everywhere underneath the panels. the site was very wet. In this scenario, what solution do you think would be most practical?
Oh, that's a good one. So I guess with the solar farm, you've got quite good access already for maintenance of the solar panels. So what you could do is a herbicide treatment underneath that to knock it back and you only need to knock Himalayan balsam back in an area for 2 years to do a program of 2-year treatment, because the seeds are only really viable for about 18 months in the soil. You'd also want to then look at making sure that the source of where those Himalayan balsam seeds has come from isn't going to repopulate it. So if you mentioned it being wet, is it in the flood zone? Have those seeds washed in that annual winter flood that's happened? If that's the case, it might be sort of a do-nothing approach is a bit better, and you might be able to come up with some novel solutions like grazing it and knocking it back, maybe some low-level sheep grazing.
Right, and in those situations where you'd advocate use of a herbicide, what kind of herbicide would you use?
It's
usually
glyphosate that's the one that's used for most. It's a broad acting herbicide, for typical plants, yeah. So that's the one that's usually used on most things. There are specific ones you can use on certain species as well if they become an issue, but it's dependent on which species.
Right. A question here about insurance guarantees. How do insurance guarantees work when you're excavating within a development area footprint when the works are expected to be undertaken within the 3-year monitoring period that you mentioned?
I'll pass that over to Thomas. He's our pro at insurance guarantees.
Nice. So good question. Yeah, so as soon as it's excavated, you can build straight on it, because you're pretty much 100% certain that you don't stop digging until you're certain that the roots are gone, and if they're not gone, you keep going. So that's why with the excavations they can get very complicated and very tricky, depending on where it is. If it's in the middle of the field, great, you can normally just come in and excavate it with ease. If it's on bordering lands with other properties and there's services involved, then it gets very, very technical and complicated. But yes, as soon as that is dug up, you are, technically you're allowed to build straight on there. So in terms of monitoring it, you would still come back just to keep an eye on the surrounds or the surrounding areas, even though there is a building on top. I'm guessing if it was a big car park and you've come in and they've completely tarmacked it, or they're built on top of it, it's still not a bad idea to come and have a look. But with most excavation works, you can give your guarantee straight after you've done the excavation work, and that comes down to the clerk of works or whoever's kind of running the project. They need to be very, very sure that that it's gone ultimately.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. I think we're going to have our last question now before we wind up. There's a question here about rusts. Has a rust been released in the UK or used for the control of Japanese knotweed or for Himalayan balsam control?
Yeah, so that's the control method that I think I touched on as one of the biological controls. So CABI, C-A-B-I, they've been doing the research on that, and if you go to their website, I think they've got loads of nice case studies that you can go look at and see where it's been released and how effective it's been. So I won't steal their research as my own. It's theirs to talk about. So they've got really good resources on their website that discuss all these as case studies.
Great, yeah, and I'd second that. I thoroughly recommend having a look at that invasive non-native species secretariat website. It's full of really useful information, and there's some downloadable guidance on all sorts of invasive species of plants and animals. So I think it just remains for me to say thank you, Rob and Thomas, for a really engaging, interesting talk. And thanks to all of you for listening to this First Thursday Club webinar. Our next event will be on December the 4th, when the subject matter will be survey and mitigation approaches for dormice on development sites. So we look forward to seeing you all then. All the best. and goodbye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.